Hey, what's up everyone? Hope you're all having a great day. With the big Season 9 update coming in a few weeks, one of the most anticipated changes might be the competitive 3.0 system, which is being accompanied by a soft MMR reset as well. With more players looking to return to the competitive mode after the update, I wanted to take the time to share what I believe to be an important part of the competitive experience. I think one of the biggest mistakes that players tend to make has really nothing to do with things like mechanics or game sense, but rather, the biggest mistake is actually a matter of our mentality and our mindset going in. In particular, I think many players struggle to climb because they don't have a mindset that facilitates improvement. As a result, they might get stuck at a certain rank for much longer than they would like to. You might think that I'm referring to the mindset that we have to simply stop blaming our teammates and get good, but I actually wanted to talk about an aspect of our mindset that I think is even more fundamental than that. Striving for a good mindset is an easy thing to say, but what does it actually mean? In my experience, there can be a lot of mental obstacles that get in the way of us pursuing our goals, and I found that by incorporating certain principles into my thought process, it has really helped me to form what I call an improvement-oriented mindset. In Overwatch, we like to talk a lot about the importance of fundamentals, because the fundamentals are the foundation on which all good gameplay is built. In this sense, developing a good mindset is in fact the most fundamental skill that you could learn, as it's the foundation on which all other skills are supported. If you genuinely want to rank up in anything, having a good mindset is, in my opinion, the first and most important thing you want to get right before you focus on anything else. For me, I think a solid improvement mindset comes down to a few fundamental ideas. The first idea is that you actually have to believe that you have what it takes to improve. It's easy to watch great players play the game and become amazed at the difference in skill level between you and them. While we should absolutely recognize the skill of great players, I think sometimes we can subconsciously fall into the trap of believing that because a certain skill gap is large, improvement is going to be way too difficult, and we stop really trying, because we stop believing that there's even a point. The important thing to remember is that every player who is currently better than you at some point in the past was exactly at the same skill level as you are now. From there, it's quite obvious that there must have been something that they did in order to get to where they are now, which means that for you, the possibility of improvement must exist to at least some capacity. You might not be aware of exactly what you have to do better, but the next step of improvement must exist, and although it might not be easy, it's important to remember that it's just a matter of discovering what that step is. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have ambitions of somehow one day becoming the best player in the world. The point is that regardless of what your end goal is, you have to believe that there is some feasible pathway by which it can be achieved, and that your ability to achieve it is just a matter of your willingness to put in the time and the effort. When we witness people who are doing better than we are, it's often the case that we see it as a sort of challenge to our ego. But instead of seeing it that way, we should see it as an opportunity to learn from other people's experiences and use it as a tool to accelerate our own skill set. With that being said, you would of course be wise to set realistic goals relative to the time and effort that you're willing to put in. Setting realistic goals and expectations stops us from discouraging ourselves. The second idea is that improvement is an incremental process. Inevitably, when we set goals for ourselves, there always seems to be a desire to reach that goal as quickly as possible. While efficiency of improvement is a relevant concern, it's important not to get carried away. Having unrealistic expectations is perhaps one of the best ways to lose motivation. If our goals we set for ourselves could be achieved overnight, what would even be the point in pursuing them in the first place? Instead, we should aim to embrace the fact that things often take time to do, and recognize that large improvements are really just a composition of smaller improvements. We don't necessarily have to wait until we've achieved something big in order to feel good about it. We should learn to appreciate even the small amounts of progress that we make. Even if you don't achieve your goals overnight, that doesn't mean that you're failing. Any amount of progress, no matter how small, should always be viewed as its own success. Walking 10,000 steps is a difficult thing if you see it as a single thing that you have to do. In comparison, walking one step is easy, and doing an easy thing 10,000 separate times doesn't seem so bad. And this change in perspective can really affect how motivated we feel when pursuing our goals. In relation to this concept of incremental improvement, the third point is that progress is often nonlinear. Even if we make slow and steady steps towards improvement, we might not always see measurable results that immediately reflect that improvement right away. It's important to remember this because it can often be quite demotivating when we put in effort but we don't see changes. The relationship between improvement and visible progress often looks like a staircase rather than a straightforward slope. Sometimes visible progress is only evident once a specific combination of individual improvements is achieved, but nevertheless, every single step of improvements matters, even if positive results aren't immediately obvious at every single step. We can often fall into the trap of feeling like our efforts are pointless when they don't result in positive outcomes right away, and this can be especially true if our efforts result in negative outcomes, which could happen for a variety of reasons. Measuring improvement is an important part of the process, but it's not the only thing that matters. Effort itself is valuable even if we feel like our progress is stagnating. We should avoid attributing breakthroughs and improvement only to very specific changes. Rather, every step leading up to that point matters equally, and remembering this allows us to maintain motivation even when things don't appear to be working. Even if we unintentionally spend time learning the wrong things and we're forced to backtrack, we shouldn't view that time as wasted. The wrong steps we take might not get us any closer to our goals, but they're still an essential part of the journey that, despite being wrong, allow us to discover the right direction in the first place. In addition, we should also keep in mind that even when we're headed in the right direction, there are just sometimes things that are out of our control that can result in negative outcomes, even when we're doing the right thing. Real improvement is a process of ups and downs, and so we shouldn't get too fixated on the short term. Even when things aren't going exactly how we want them to, remember that it's just all part of the process. I should also mention that effort is not the same thing as trying hard. Persistence is indeed an element of effort that is very valuable, but persistence alone is often not enough. Effort also involves an element of intentionality, so it's important not to just try to do things, but to think about what you're trying to do as well. The fourth idea is that you should focus on comparing yourself to where you started rather than your end goal, focusing on the progress you've already made rather than the progress you haven't made. Of course, having a clear picture of our goals is important, but when that's the only thing we focus on, we lack the continual source of motivation that's necessary in order to keep moving forward. When we focus on our progress, we continually build a habit of positive reinforcement rather than negative. We're not failing to arrive at where we want to be, we're succeeding in moving away from where we were. By focusing on the journey rather than the finish line, it's easier to associate our desire to pursue our goals with positive values. We should tell ourselves to keep up the good work rather than telling ourselves to not give up. When we tell ourselves not to give up, we subconsciously believe that we have good reasons to do that, which makes our journey a lot more frustrating than it has to be. I find that one way of creating positive motivation is by phrasing the reasoning of our actions as things that we want to do rather than things that we have to do. When we think of reasons that we have to do something, we often are implicitly also coming up with reasons that we don't want to do it, which is naturally going to be quite demotivating. The difference between want to and have to is the difference between things you value versus things you do not. By rephrasing the reasoning of our actions as something that we actively want to pursue, it sounds like a small change, but it can make quite a big difference in how we think and feel about our goals. If you have a goal that requires a lot of practice in order to achieve, telling yourself that you have to practice can really make things feel tedious and uninspiring. Reminding oneself that you want to achieve your goals and therefore by extension you want to practice can really increase motivation. In some ways, this is the precise difference between obsession and passion, two things that can often look very similar and can be used to accomplish goals but represent two very different types of people. Intuitively, we want to be passionate about our goals and not obsessive. Obsession is often driven by the fear of failing to become who you think you need to be, and passion is driven by the desire to become or fulfill who you know you already are. Maybe optimal motivation is driven by the combination of both the positive and the negative. If you find yourself constantly frustrated when pursuing your goals, perhaps you've lost sight of why you want to do what you're doing in the first place. The fifth and final point is that you should never be afraid of experimenting and making mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes that we can make as we start to develop a basic understanding is that we can begin to avoid making mistakes to the point that it's detrimental to our improvement. Naturally, in order to get better at a certain skill, you need to be willing to venture outside of your comfort zone, and you need to be willing to accept that you will make some mistakes along the way. As beginners, we often have no comfort zone to speak of, which is why beginners often seem to have no issues at the start and can even learn things quite quickly. As people progress beyond being a beginner, they might find that progress eventually seems to become more difficult than it should be. A common reason that this occurs is simply because as we develop a basic understanding, we also develop the ability to identify basic errors, and because we're afraid of making mistakes, we automatically prevent ourselves from finding new ways to improve. With our basic understanding, we become comfortable doing things a certain way, and we forget to question whether or not the intuitions we've developed are actually correct. We might be aware that we have certain weaknesses, and instead of doing things to challenge those weaknesses, we try to play around them. But in doing so, we never actually end up solving those weaknesses, preventing ourselves from making any progress. Counterintuitively, we shouldn't try to do our best. Instead, strive to go slightly beyond what you think you're capable of, and be willing to accept that in doing so, you might not be as good as you could be right now, but by doing so, you give yourself a chance to discover things beyond what you're already capable of. Try to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I'm not just saying that as a sort of pep talk. On even a neurological level, our brains require frustrating experiences in order to identify possible areas of improvement. When we do something incorrectly, we naturally get frustrated, and when we do something correctly, we might feel satisfied. This connection between frustration and satisfaction is precisely how our brains identify the neural pathways that need improvement. When you're frustrated with yourself, our brains can identify the neural pathways that cause that frustration, and from that, it knows that those pathways are probably in need of improvement. When changes lead to a result that you feel is successful and consequently satisfying, our brains recognize that those changes are the ones that led to improvement and therefore need to be solidified. By recognizing and facilitating this mechanism of improvement, you can associate frustration with positive feedback, and you might be surprised at just how efficiently you're capable of learning things once you can do that. As a bonus sixth point, remember to take your health seriously, both mentally and physically. Things like nutrition and sleep are oftentimes some of the first things we sacrifice in the name of being productive, and yet, many ailments that result from a lack of proper nutrition and sleep are perhaps some of the most common reasons for not being productive, which is rather ironic, especially if we're looking at long-term productivity. Sleep in particular is a necessary part of our neurological learning mechanism, as that's the time when neural pathways are actually being changed. And of course, it's also a necessary requirement for optimal cognitive function. An improvement-oriented mindset should not be fundamentally motivated by the desire to improve at skills, it's the desire to improve oneself, and so sacrificing your own health for the sake of improving some area of your life doesn't really make sense. That's not to say that we never make short-term sacrifices for the sake of our future selves, just make sure that it's really your future that you have in mind. Basically, remember to prioritize your own well-being, because ultimately, the core motivation for wanting to do anything in the first place should always be the recognition that you value and respect yourself. That's all I have to say for now. Let me know your thoughts about this topic and feel free to share any of your own strategies for success. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like and comment to support the channel. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day.